Hello everyone, this is Pandul Hub. So today we are going to look into Java interview questions. I feel this would be very helpful for you guys. So let's get into the questions. So the first question is, what are solid principles in Java? So the word solid acronym stands for different responsibilities. So, like the first one is the S stands for single responsibility principle. So, this states that every Java class must perform single functionality. So, what does that mean? Because when we develop an application or when we develop some code, we may have a necessity to write an n number of classes. So, we need to make sure that each and every class has or depicts only a single functionality instead of more functionalities being combined together to a single class. The next principle is open closed principle for O, and here what it depicts is it's it should be open, like the classes or the code that we develop should be open for extension, but they should be closed for modification. This is because, for example, we may have a class which you have already written being used by a 10 number of users, and the 11th user comes and he needs some modification and he needs some extra attributes or extra functionality to be added to the existing class. Then instead of modifying the existing class, we can or he can extend it by adding additional parameters to the existing one so that the other 10 users who have been already using that will not be affected by it. So next going on with L, which is Liskov substitution principle. So what does this say is derived classes must be completely substitutable for their base classes. So what does this mean is, for example, you have a parent class A and a child class derived from A, which can be B. So in this case, what does this principle say is the derived class B should be completely able to substitute the parent class A without affecting the program behavior. So next going on with I, which is the interface segregation principle. So here it says is to segregate larger interfaces to smaller ones. So this is similar like the single responsibility principle where you have a single responsibility for each class. Similarly, if you have that is when you are developing a code, you may come across different functionalities or different use cases or different user areas, whichever will be suitable to particular scenario kind of thing. So instead of combining all the functionalities into a single interface, you can segregate and have different small interfaces so that it will be easier for the others to understand your code and it would be easier just to extend or reuse the code that we have already written. For example, let's consider calculating an area of a rectangle, a triangle, or a square. So in this case, you can just have different interfaces for calculating area of triangle, rectangle, or square instead of going on with a single interface or a single class for calculating the area for all these shapes. So going on with this D, which is dependency inversion principle, here it says that we should use abstractions instead of concrete implementations. So what does this mean, abstractions? So instead of the real implementation of the code or the real definition, we can just go with abstractions like interfaces and abstract classes. So this abstraction, what helps us is it gives us a loosely coupled code so that we don't have more dependencies and it will help us to reuse the code and help us to easily debug or find the cause or just to have a better understanding for the others when we write a code. So the next question, what are is a and has a relationships in Java? So is a relationship is inheritance. So I think everyone know what's inheritance. That is, we have the parent class and we have the child classes inheriting the parent class. So inheriting classes are called as subclasses or child classes, which is a type of a parent class. So we have the parent class and we have the child classes inheriting from the parent class. So this child classes include all the properties of the parent class in addition to its own variables and methods. So for example, an apple is a fruit. So you will extend fruit to get an apple. So here fruit represents the parent class and apple represents the derived or the subclass or the child class which extends the fruit. So here in this case where is a relationship, here the apple or the fruit can exist independently. Both the classes can exist independently. So in that case, so if you feel there is one class and the other child class, if both the parent and the child are not interdependent and they can survive without each other independently, in that case we go with a easy relationship. So going on with has a relationship, which is a composition, means creating instances which have references to other objects. So for example, a room has a table. So will you create a classroom and then in that class create an instance of type table. So in this case, how it depicts is, it is like you are having an instance of the table inside the class. Okay, so has a relationship comes into picture like without, so the class cannot exist without that instance inside it. So for example, you can go with a vehicle class which has the engine. So a vehicle cannot survive without an engine. So in this case, vehicle has an engine. So here comes the has a relationship into the picture. So if you feel there is an instance or an attribute which cannot so which the parent class or which the class cannot survive without that instance. In that case, we go with the has a relationship. So has a relationship is dynamic, that is, it has a runtime binding, while inheritance is a static binding, which happens at the compile time. So the third question is, what do you understand by an instance variable and a local variable? So coming on with instance variables. So instance variables are those variables that are accessible by all the methods in the class. So they are declared outside the methods and inside the class and describe the properties of an object. So instance variables belong to they are nothing but the variables or the properties of the class. So all the objects of the class will have their copy of the variables for utilization. If any modification is done on those variables, then only that instance will be impacted by it and all other class instances continue to remain unaffected. For example, you have a class athlete. So if you create an object for this class, say object 1, and you are going to have a specific name and speed for that object 1, and you're going to create a one more object, say object 2, and you have the name and speed specific to that object 2. So you have two objects with two different configurations or the property values set to name and speed. So any change in the object 1 will never ever affect the object 2 because both object 1 and 2 are instance variables which have their own copy of the properties present in the class. So now going on with these local variables. So the local variables are present within a block, function, or constructor and can be accessed only inside them. So they are present inside the block, function, or constructor. It represents these local variables have their scope only within that block, function, or constructor. So outside that, they'll not be accessible. So the next question, what are the default values assigned to variables and instances in Java? So for local variables, we don't have any default values being assigned. We need to initialize the value before using it. Otherwise, it will throw a compilation error. So you have the local variables inside the block, function, or a method, and the compiler or the Java doesn't assign any values to it until we assign it. For example, you have a variable called a, which is of string type, and you want to use it. If you want to use it, first we need to assign some value to it, or we need to initialize it before we use it. But coming to instance variables, if we create the object, then the default value will be initialized by the default constructor depending on the data type. So what does this say is, for the instance variables in the class, the default values for those variables will be assigned by the constructor. For example, if it is a reference, we have a reference data type. We have a reference variable inside the class, then it will be assigned to null. If it's a numeric, then it will be assigned to 0. And if it is a Boolean, it will be assigned to false. So based on the variables that we declare inside the class, which form the instance variables, they will be given the default values by the default constructor depending on the data type you have mentioned. So the next question is, what is the difference between equals and equal to equal to? So equals is defined in the object class, and we can override the equals method in the custom class for objects comparison. That is, if you're going to have your own class, that is, you're going to write a class for string comparison, or you have some class of like employee, and you want to compare two objects of that class based on your own criteria, you can override this equals method and have your own logic and compare it and compare the attributes of the employee class or your own custom class based on your requirements. And here equals checks for the contents and returns true if the contents are equal. And next, going on with the equal to equal to. So this represents the binary operator in Java. So this it cannot be modified, and it always compares the hash code and not the contents of the variables. So the hash code represents, it compares the addresses or references of the variables or the objects to which they are pointing to. So when you have two variables being compared using the equal to, so their memory location, so the memory location of the objects to which they are pointing are compared instead of comparing their content. So the next question is, can the main method be overloaded? Yes, we can overload the main method, and you can do it a number of times. You can have n number of overloaded main methods, but the JVM will look only for the main method, which has a definition of a public static void main, including the arguments of string array. So it should have an access modifier of public static and a return type of void, followed by the method name as main, and the parameters that it should contain is the string array. So this is the format or the syntax for which the JVM will be looking on for the main method. So all the other methods with name main will be considered as the overloaded methods, and that will not be considered as the main method by the JVM. So the next question. Explain the use of final keyword in variable, method, and class. So this final keyword is used as defining something as constant, final, and represents the non-access modifier. So basically it is used to define a constant or the behavior to be restricted. So depending upon if it's a variable or method or a class, it varies. So first going on with this final variable. So when the variable is declared as final, the value cannot be modified. So the value of that variable cannot be modified. And if that variable is not initially assigned with a value, it's only the constructor of the class which can assign the value to it. So going on with final method, so when a method is declared to be final, it cannot be overridden by its child classes. So the child classes are nothing but the derived classes which are created using the extend keyword of the parent class. A constructor is also a method to our knowledge. So a constructor. But the constructor cannot be marked as final because whenever a class is inherited, the constructors are not inherited. Each and every class has its own constructor because the constructors are the methods having the name of the class. So for every class, the class name is going to differ and they're going to have their own constructor. Hence, marking it final doesn't make sense. So Java throws a compilation error saying modifier final not allowed here. So going on with final class, no classes can be inherited from the class declared as final, but the final class can extend other classes for its usage. So for example, you have a class called employee which is declared as final, then no other class can extend or no other class can be derived from this employee class since it is marked as final. But the employee class, which is a final one, can inherit, that is, it can extend or implement any number of classes and interfaces. So the next question is, do final, finally, and finalize keywords have the same function? So going with final, it is used to place restriction on classes, variables, or methods which we have just now seen. So the final class cannot be inherited, final methods cannot be overridden, and final variables cannot be modified once assigned. Hope we are clear with this because the previous question was on the same keyword, which was final. So going on with finally, finally is nothing but it's a block of code that gets executed irrespective of handling of exceptions. There is finally represents it's a block of code in your class. So irrespective of whether there are exceptions which are caused because of some code in the program or if the program has executed successfully, in both the cases, this block of code is going to get executed. Probably you can use these codes to depict or to show the user when you have the exceptions, or in the case of file streams, or in the case where you use some connections and all those things, you can use this finally block to close all those things. Yeah. So now going on with finalize. So this method is called prior to the garbage collection of an object. So this method is the last chance for the object before it is being garbage collected. If you want to do something on the object for the last time, then this method is the one where you can write the code after which the object will be garbage collected. So the next question is the difference between static methods, static variables, and static classes in Java. So coming on with static methods and static variables belongs to class and not a particular object of a class. So both methods and variables have the scope of the class rather than they are not associated to a particular object of the class. Since they are associated or have the scope at the class level, the static methods and variables can be invoked directly using the class name instead of the objects of the class. So here is the example, like the mathematical functions like max, min, square root, power, etc. They can be invoked directly with the class name like math. So this math represents the class, and these methods are the static methods since they are just directly called using the class name instead of creating an object for this math class. Similarly, the length attribute present in the array, which helps in getting the length of the array, is a static variable. So since this length is a static variable, this can be directly accessed using the class name array dot length. So going on with static classes, a class in a Java program cannot be static except if it is a inner class. So I hope everyone is aware of this inner class. So this inner class is nothing but you have a class written inside a class. So you can't have a direct class which can be static. Instead, the inner classes can only be declared as static. If it is an inner static class, then it exactly works like other static members of the class. So this inner class, which when declared as a static, has the same behavior like the static methods and variables, like the whole scope belongs to the class and they can be invoked using the class names instead of creating the objects. Okay, so the next question, why is string immutable? String as immutable implies the object cannot be changed, but its reference to the object can be modified. So what does this object being changed or reference? So what does this immutable mean? So immutable represents it cannot be modified or changed. So why do we need so? So for example, you have a string variable called str1 which is assigned with a value hello. So in this first line, what happens is you have the string pool where you create in a string pool an object with the value of hello is created and it is being pointed to the string variable which you have created for now, which is str1. And now going on to the second line, which is the concatenation of this string, that is for the existing string variable you are concatenating it with a value called everyone. So here, instead of modifying the existing variable value inside the string pool, what it does is it creates a new value in the string pool and then it updates the reference of the existing variable. So this way what happens is once the object which has been created in a string pool will not be modified, but if there is a change in an existing value, a new value will be created with updating the reference of that string variable. So what are the advantages of being the string as an immutable one? So here are some like security parameters. Like security parameters are typically represented as string in network connections, database connections, usernames and passwords. So if one can easily change the string, then these parameters could be changed easily and it would be easy for a third party or a third person to use all this important secured informations. And coming to synchronization and concurrency. So since the string is immutable, we don't need to worry about the thread safety because since they are immutable, it automatically takes care of the thread safety, solving the synchronization issues for us. And going for catching, so what does compiler help us in the case of catching is if two objects have the same value, then only one string object exists in the pool so that these two objects use the same value in the string pool. So for example, you have str1 and str2, two string variables with values hello. Both the variables point to the same object in the string pool, which is hello. Instead of creating two objects with the same strings in the string pool, only one object will be created and this will be referenced by two string variables outside. And going with class loading, so class loading, we may need a lot of classes during the compile time or runtime, and the Java by default uses the string data type for the arguments for the class name for class loading. So if this string is immutable, in that case it helps us so that these class names will not be changed. But if the string is immutable, then it may cause some lot of confusions during the class loading scenarios. So this is one of the additional thing where the string helps us during the class loading. Thank you everyone. Thank you for watching the video. I hope it was very helpful for you guys. And please do check out the other parts for additional questions. And if you like the video, please share it and subscribe to the channel, which is Pandul Hub. And please do let me know the comments if you have anything in the comment section.